10 a.m. A spot of breakfast. We plod clumsily into the kitchen, our tired limbs heavy and stiff, and ponder how best to quell our gurgling belly. The problem is that we're hosting a dinner party tonight, so we don't want to ruin our appetite. Perhaps if we just nibble some cereal, then grab a sandwich at 2 o'clock, that might suffice. But then again, those are some meagre rations, and this is meant to be an enjoyable day off. So, new plan. Let's enjoy a hearty breakfast, load up on calories, and then skip lunch instead. After all, the custom of eating 3 meals per day only became common in Britain by the late 18th century, when artificial lighting began to shove bedtime further around the clock face. The Romans, for example, mostly enjoyed just 1 formal meal per day, cena, and merely nibbled on snacks or prandium when they got peckish. Even in the Middle Ages, most English people ate only twice, with breakfast, a 15th century word meaning the end of the fast, following morning prayer, and dinner being served around noon. Of course, we might now use dinner to mean the evening meal, and lunch to mean the midday option. But lunch is a very modern concept, adopted in the early 1800s, and its linguistic origins are so fiercely debated that if I even try to discuss them, I'll likely get a punch in the face from a disgruntled etymologist. So, let's swing open the fridge door and see what feast might be possible. What's in the cupboard? The electric fridge was first invented in the 1870s, when it was a cumbersome contraption that had to be hand-cranked by some unfortunate kitchen minion. But it didn't really become a widespread thing until the arrival of the modern electrified kitchen in the 1950s. Now, of course, it's an indispensable technology that most of us just can't live without. But for about 99% of human history, people somehow managed to do exactly that. They ate their food fresh, or found ingenious ways to preserve it in salt, vinegars and butter. Or they stashed it away in dark larders, buried it underground, or crammed it into ice-stuffed sheds to slow the spoiling process. But despite all these options, long-term preservation was a perennial problem. A poor harvest, crappy weather, or perhaps a beetle infestation was all it took for our ancestors to be cast into the hellish jaws of famine. People in the Middle Ages were cruelly taunted by the so-called Hungry Gap, a period in which the winter granaries were empty, but the new crop was not yet ready. People could die of malnutrition on a beautiful spring day within spitting distance of plentiful fields brimming with tantalizingly half-grown food that in just a few weeks would have been their salvation. It's no wonder medieval sources speak of desperate farmers selling their kids in return for food, or throwing themselves at the mercy of their feudal masters, or surrendering themselves into slavery, or just foraging like pigs in the forests. One horrible story, recounted by the Anglo-Saxon monk known as the Venerable Bede, described how a famine in Sussex led to the desperate scene, where, as he says, 40 or 50 men, wasted with hunger, would go together to some precipice or to the seashore, where in their misery they would join hands and leap into the sea, perishing wretchedly either by the fall or by drowning. Until very recently then, the prospect of going hungry when a staple crop failed was a spectre that haunted most of our ancestors. When the fields of maize refused to materialize, the 16th century occupants of Mexico were seen chewing spiders, ant eggs, deer manure and soil, while the blight that caused the Irish potato famine of 1844 to 49 claimed 1 million lives and forced another million to emigrate on filthy coffin ships to the USA, giving rise to that infamous Celtic diaspora that, at least in terms of self-identification on official forms, means there are 7 times as many Irish Americans in the USA as there are Irish in Ireland. In medieval China, there were at least 400 so-called famine foods, including tree bark and grassy herbs. But in the 1950s, the country was struck by probably the worst famine in human history as a result of Chairman Mao's cataclysmic Great Leap Forward, a collectivized agricultural policy based on extreme communist ideology that stripped food away from the farmers and handed it to the cities, causing an estimated 35 million people to perish. Tragically, the era of famine is far from over. Parts of Africa still struggle with drought, and the North Korean crazy train, driven by the woefully uncharismatic Kim Jong-un, is slowly trundling up the hill towards China's massive death toll, tooting its stupid isolationist horn all the way. So we should be grateful then that this morning there is food to be found inside our fridge. And as we peek inside, we notice a full carton of semi-skim milk, begging to be opened up and guzzled. Suddenly, inspiration dawns upon our sleep-addled mind, and a cunning plan begins to ferment. What if, while we're deciding what to have for breakfast, we enjoy a cheeky bowl of cereal, purely as an emergency interim measure to silence our rumbling tummy? As ideas go, it might be the best one we have all day, although I'm willing to concede that it's this kind of logic that's making the world obese. A nice bowl of cereal. The eating of breakfast cereal and the practice of masturbation might usually be assumed to be mutually exclusive activities, unless you've developed some sort of weird Cocoa Pops fetish. But strangely, their history is intimately intertwined. Dr. John Harvey Kellogg was a physician from Michigan, a lovely rhyming epithet worthy of a Dr. Seuss character or a professional wrestler, but he spent no time in either latex or a massive cartoon hat, because he was a serious man with a curative zeal driven not just by concerns for his patients' welfare, but also by a moralistic worldview coloured by the concept of sin. And one sin, in particular, really pissed him off. To Kellogg, masturbation wasn't just a single finger salute to the Almighty. When a person took their own genitals in their hands, they were also taking their life in their hands, because, in his mind, self-abuse was the likely cause of 39 medical conditions, including cancer. So, seeing as he was the chief physician at the Battle Creek Sanitarium, Kellogg felt responsible for the well-being of its inmates, and, being a vegetarian, he believed that the carefully regulated diet could help reduce the animalistic passions that led to all that hazardous self-abuse. He recommended bland meals devoid of taste or spiciness, lots of cereal, and half a pint of yogurt squirted up the bum to keep mind and body worthy of God's good intentions. Meanwhile, Kellogg's younger brother, Will Keith Kellogg, had also taken a job at the sanitarium as the bookkeeper. But soon he took a sideline interest in John's dietary theories and began helping out in the kitchens. One day, in 1894, Will was boiling wheat, intended as an easily digestible bread substitute, when he became distracted. Upon returning to his pans, he found disaster had struck. The wheat had softened into an inedible gloop. Ever the bean counter, however, Will figured he'd try to salvage the wasted food and save a few dollars in the process by squishing it through large rollers to squeeze out the oozing liquid. It was a bit of a long shot, but surprisingly, it produced edible wheat flakes. Hoping they got away with it, the brothers decided to serve this odd novelty to their patients, and they got an enthusiastic reply. Motivated to improve the recipe, Will began tinkering with other cereals to see if he could build upon this fortuitous accident, and after much experimentation, he discovered that cornflakes were the superior choice. Soon, they were manufacturing their flakes not just for the inpatients, but for those middle-class health nuts who checked out, gone home to their families, and still hankered for it. This, to John, was sufficient, but Will foresaw huge profits in the product. Indeed, the brothers were not the only health food pioneers, and money was already being made elsewhere. Dr. James Caleb Jackson had already brought granular breakfast cereal to market and forced the Kellogg's, via legal threats, to rebrand theirs as granola instead. But this didn't impede the siblings for long, least of all Will. In 1906, he founded the Battle Creek Toasted Cornflake Company, and 3 years later he made a crucial decision to add sugar to the recipe, so as to lure in more punters. This was a betrayal of John's high-minded moral crusade against masturbation, as he believed sugar induced sexy thoughts. Indeed, it proved to be a disagreement that shattered their sibling relationship. To John, they may as well have been branded pornflakes. But, sad as the familial rift was, Will was suitably compensated by the Kellogg's cereal empire swiftly growing to dominate the American market before soon colonising the breakfast tables of Europe as well. Milking it. We open up the cereal box, cram our arm into the packaging, and hunt for the free plastic toy like a chimp fishing for termites. Triumphant, we place our gift on the table and sprinkle nutritious flakes from the carton into our bowl. Then we reach for the milk, break the seal, and splash the cold, creamy liquid over the top. Yum! Except it's not remotely yum if you're lactose intolerant, which is a genetic condition shared by a large proportion of the world's population. I grew up believing that drinking cow's milk was normal, and that those who can't, because it gives them painful flatulence, are the odd ones. But it turns out that milk slurpers are the new kids on the block. Our prehistoric ancestors were hunting animals millions of years ago, but it wasn't until the Neolithic era that humans actually consumed their milk. Is it simply that it hadn't occurred to us before? Were we too busy hiding from cave lions? Well, maybe. But in reality, it's biology that determined the success of the switchover, not lack of effort. Until about 7,500 years ago, our adult ancestors simply couldn't process the sugary lactose in milk, just as 70% of the world population still can't today. It was only random mutations in the MC-M6 gene that produced an enzyme called lactase that stops the uncomfortable buildup of stomach gas. This handy genetic upgrade meant that at some point, a European farmer washed down a jug of warm fresh milk, sauntered away, and wasn't immediately converted into a methane factory. Delighted at the taste and invigorated by proteins, fats, and calcium, this person raised their children on animal milk as well, and gradually the mutated genes were passed down through the generations and became normalized in European, Indian, and African populations, where cow, goat, sheep, and horse milk became a regular part of the diet. If we'd coloured in a map of the world to represent dairy consumption in the pre-Columbus era, North and South America would have been totally unshaded until the mass immigration from Europe and the introduction of African slaves, both of which radically shifted America's genetic makeup. Famously, Illinois, Minnesota, and Wisconsin established themselves as producers of butter and cheese, which could be transported safely around the country. But milk was a bigger problem. New York's enormous expansion in the mid-1800s saw demand for milk skyrocket, but it couldn't come from as far away as Minnesota, as it had morphed into rank yogurt by the time it arrived. So specialist dairy farms were set up on the eastern seaboard to ship milk into the metropolis by train. But even then, all sorts of unappealing techniques were used to preserve it for the journey and improve its appearance, including the addition of water, almonds, animal brains, and even formaldehyde, an obnoxious disinfectant more commonly found in funeral parlours. What's more, hygiene standards on these farms were appalling, and until the official sanitation reforms of the early 1900s, bacteria-infested milk was one of the leading causes of urban disease. The catchphrase on the advertising billboards might as well have been lactose-lipped celebs coughing their guts out and muttering, "Got milk? Then you've probably got TB." From foragers to farmers. So, emergency cereal ration aside, what are we going to cook for our primary morning meal? Many modern societies have their own traditional breakfasts. The Aussies smear Vegemite on toast, the French munch croissant, the Israelis delight in olives and cheeses, the Alaskans plump for reindeer and pancakes. But to me, there's only one defining breakfast of champions, and that's the heart-bursting full English, guaranteed by doctors to shorten your lifespan by a decade. Delicious! Filled with culinary excitement, we reach into our fridge and pull out some rashers of bacon and a string of herby sausages, which will shortly fill our kitchen with the salty aroma of sizzling pig. And by doing this, we're continuing a tradition stretching back into the Stone Age. Humans have eaten meat for millions of years, and at some point between 400,000 and 1.9 million years ago, the debate hasn't quite settled on when, our ancestors worked out how to control fire and thereby cook their dinners, which in turn better released calorific energy in their food and prompted the development of bigger human brains. And if it was brains you wanted to grow, then it was brains you needed to eat. Well, sort of. Cavemen feasted on every part of the animal with the undiscerning enthusiasm of feral zombies. Offal, meat, squishy grey matter, and even the stomach contents were all cooked up and gobbled down. But to do this, they had to catch the beasts in the first place, which required a nomadic lifestyle of constant pursuit to track the movement of wandering herds. About 11,000 years ago, however, in what's now Turkey, this million-year tradition began to be gradually phased out in favour of the show-stopping razzmatazz of the Neolithic revolution in agriculture. We often hear anxious skeptics attacking genetically modified crops because it's not a natural way to farm, or so they say, as if these newer varieties are the product of some Gothic scientist in a windswept castle. Yet, natural farming is an oxymoron. Farming is a human-made invention, and even the crops we think of as organic are themselves the product of our tinkering. Each time you nibble corn on the cob, you're enjoying the selective horticultural meddling of an ancient Mexican farmer who died 3,500 years ago. Nor was it just crops that defined this new age of food production. The so-called Neolithic Revolution also delivered the first domestication of livestock, meaning that our ancestors no longer had to chase their dinners across the wilderness, but instead could saunter out the front door, pick from the penned-in beast snuffling around the edges of the village, and eat them. Pigs were first domesticated in China around 6,000 years ago. They were particularly easy to rear because they'll basically eat anything. They don't require verdant pastures, they produce big litters, and they gain an extraordinary 2 pounds in weight every day until they reach adulthood. Other animals required greater effort, but also produced milk and fur and wool in recompense. Counterintuitively, however, scientific analysis has shown that the increased proximity to all those animals introduced us to a bevy of new diseases, such as measles, mumps, influenza, smallpox, malaria, and worst of all, the blasted common cold, nature's most annoying illness that renders us just fit enough for work, but miserably so. So, if farming made us less robust and increased our risk of catching diseases, why did our ancestors stick with it? After all, the nomadic bushmen of the Kalahari only spend 19 hours per week hunting and gathering, and the rest they dedicate to leisure. If we told them to start growing crops, they'd stare at us in puzzlement and ask, why bother? What, then, maintained the desire for problematic agriculture? The only answer that makes sense to me is the issue of food security. A life spent chasing prey over many miles and foraging for nuts and berries must surely have been filled with terrifying dry spells when nothing could be found and stomachs began to shrivel. Or maybe people just really liked being able to have bacon whenever they wanted. That's certainly what would have earned my vote if I'd been at that meeting. That, and also limitless ice cream. Or even limitless bacon-flavoured ice cream. Actually, no, maybe not. Ham and haram. We appear to have veered off on a weird bacon tangent, but let's stick with it, because pork is one of those meats with a distinctive cultural heritage. The Egyptians were occasional pig munchers, and despite the sultry climate, found that curing the ham meant it could be preserved for year-round consumption. This is probably no surprise. After all, they were well drilled in preservation techniques, having spent centuries perfecting mummification. In fact, they used the same word for both curing a pig carcass and preparing a corpse for the afterlife, which one hopes never led to any accidental cannibalism when someone mixed up the paperwork. Similarly, as we roll a couple of sausages into our frying pan, it's worth noting that Romans also enjoyed bacon. They called it petasso. Served with figs, wine and pepper, and they gorged themselves on hot Lucanian pork sausages from southern Italy, seasoned with herbs and cured in the sharp, tangy smoke of the fire. The quality of these could be very good, or they could be little more than organic condoms crammed with guts and eyeballs. This might partially explain why, later on in the 4th century, sausages were thought to be a barbarian food, unbefitting a Christian, and so were outlawed in Roman cities. Another problem with sausage meat is that you never know what animal, or organ, you're actually chewing on. Long before the American hot dog conquered the bleachers of baseball stadia, the great Athenian philosopher Socrates was already deeply suspicious of whether sausages were more pooch than pig. Pork remained the defining staple meat for many medieval Europeans, including even the rural poor, thanks to the ease with which half-wild tusked pigs could be reared in woodlands. But the availability of this widespread meat didn't stop religious morality from prohibiting its consumption. In medieval Christianity, meat was banned on holy days, during Lent and on Fridays, leaving about half the year during which fish and veggies had to be substituted in, though some cunning monks managed to argue that beaver was a fish because it was vaguely aquatic. Clever them. Consequently, on the eve of the 40 days of Lent, English medieval Christians enjoyed a slap-up feast of collops, made by frying up any bacon and eggs for a last-ditch cholesterol high before they switched to their restricted diets. This, it seems, is the origins of the English love of bacon and eggs, which we are soon to enjoy ourselves. But, of course, once Lent was done, they could get back to nibbling on swine. For Jews and Muslims, however, this was never going to be okay. In Islam, ham is haram, a forbidden sin, mirroring the early traditions set forth in the Jewish faith that declares pigs to be unclean to eat. Various theories have been advanced as to why this became the case, with the most common being that pork was believed to cause certain diseases. But that seems unlikely, given that the Jewish kashrut laws also ban other animals from the dinner table, and the rationale for such prohibition is hard to square with what we know about veterinary epidemiology. For example, a key criteria for Jews is that an animal mustn't be eaten if it has cloven hooves or chews its grassy cud, unless, curiously enough, it does both of these things, in which case it's perfectly delicious. This, of course, was bad news for Israeli cows. The laws seem far more cultural than medical, and they also ban shellfish, lizards, camels, hares, and most insects from the menu, all of which were readily munched by other peoples in the same part of the world, seemingly without much in the way of dangerous repercussions. The only convincing aspect of the health argument is that nothing can be eaten by Jews which has died of natural causes, an entirely sensible precaution that sidesteps the risk of consuming diseased flesh. I'm also told by a friend that roadkill is prohibited, though that's a more modern interpretation rather than a direct scriptural quote. At no point in the Torah or the Talmud does it say, "You can't eat a badger squished by a truck." Yes, we can! As the bacon and sausages sizzle, we reach into our cupboard and pluck out a tin of baked beans, the very definition of comfort food for many an impoverished British student. The can is an airtight tube, sealed at both ends, and they will soon chuck the empty container in the recycling bin with barely a flicker of appreciation. This simple technology was once a marvellous revolution in culinary history, and it was the result of a strange cooperation between enemies. For millennia, an army had marched on its stomach, to quote the celebrity Corsican Napoleon Bonaparte, and the logistical puzzle of feeding soldiers and sailors was a head-scratcher to flummox even a chess grandmaster. How did one supply tens of thousands of men, miles from friendly shores or towns, with sufficient rations to fuel their grueling demands when the food itself spoils so quickly that it needs to be replaced every few days? If an army couldn't rely on stripping the nearby countryside of its resources, then what was the solution? In search of an answer, in 1795, the French government embraced crowdsourcing and offered a prize to any boffin able to solve the quandary. In 1810, after the prize money had gone uncollected for some 15 years, a cook named Nicolas Appert claimed his 12,000 francs. The son of a hotelier, Appert had initially trained as a chef, but switched to become a confectioner, a trade in which he explored the preservation of fruit in sugary jellies. For a decade, he experimented with sealing food in glass jars, and then boiling them for different lengths of time. And in 1804, he impressed the French Navy, and then the Army, with his invention. By 1809, an official committee had been called to sample his preserved foods, and found them to be deliciously maggot-free. Appert clearly deserved his prize, which was handed to him on the condition that he published his theory and didn't patent it. And so, in 1810, The Art of Preserving All Kinds of Animal and Vegetable Substances for Several Years appeared in print, and Appert became a media darling, flogging his luxurious preserved wares from an elegant Parisian showroom. Tellingly, despite his success, he had no scientific understanding of why his techniques worked. Germ theory and the discovery of bacteria was still 50 years away, and Louis Pasteur, one of the pioneering scientists to discover it, hadn't even been born yet. Appert, the new hero of food storage, had blundered his way to victory. What's more, though hailed as the father of canning, he hadn't actually invented the can. Indeed, his glass jars sometimes exploded due to the high internal pressure, and they were prone to being fractured if dropped. And they were also a bloody nightmare to open, making them less than ideal for war zones. Instead, it was another Frenchman, Philippe de Girard, who devised the now familiar tin can. Yet instead of touting his invention around France, Girard pursued the healthier British market instead, though this wasn't without complications. The two nations were in the midst of the Napoleonic Wars, and Britain wasn't exactly rolling out the red carpet to people with thick Gallic accents. So Girard hired an English merchant called Peter Durand to take out the patent on his behalf. But clearly his invention was of sufficient interest to suppress any xenophobic frog bashing from the scientific community, as records show that Girard somehow snuck his way out of France to make regular visits to the Royal Society in London. Intriguingly, Girard's involvement ended soon after, as his patent was snapped up and put into production by Brian Donkin, an English engineer who wowed the Duke of Wellington and the British Admiralty with his long-life canned meats, preserved within the tin jacket. By 1814, these novel tin cans were sailing the high seas and trundling across the battlefields of Europe, to the delight of sailors and soldiers who wrote back to London exclaiming joyfully that their dinners were no longer accessorised with that weird-smelling mould. Just 5 years after Appert had picked up his prize cheque from the French government, Napoleon Bonaparte faced off against the British at the infamous Battle of Waterloo in 1815, where he may have been royally peeved to discover that not only were his adversaries carrying tin food in their wagon trains, but a Frenchman had been the one to put them there. So much for patriotism. Thankfully, our own can of baked beans has one of those newfangled ring pulls on the top, and doesn't require the dreaded can opener to be clumsily clamped onto the metal lip. Still, at least the thing exists. In a weird quirk of history, the can opener wasn't invented until 1870, a lengthy 48 years after the can itself. It seems people spent the best part of half a century frustratingly smashing the tins open with hammers and chisels, as if they were the furious, bone-thumping apes in Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey. Been anywhere nice recently? In 1477, a recently rediscovered ancient text by the Greek geographer Ptolemy was at last printed in Europe, some 1300 years after it had been written. This edition came complete with a rather snazzy map of the world, allegedly drawn by a mysterious ancient cartographer named Agathodaimon. This book was one of several ancient works to have re-entered public consciousness via the libraries of the Islamic world, and they lit a fire beneath a lot of European navigators who were eager to explore the fringes of what was surely a larger world beyond the known horizon. One of these impassioned hopefuls was the self-made, self-interested Genoan named Cristoforo Colombo, who we prefer to name Columbus, if only to avoid confusing him with the raincoat-clad crime-solving genius of Saturday afternoon telly. Since before even Roman times, Mediterranean merchant captains had been sailing from the port of Alexandria in northern Egypt on a southeasterly course to the exotic lands of India, where the locals traded in luxurious spices such as pepper, cinnamon, ginger, cloves, nutmeg, saffron, turmeric, and many others. In fact, recent scientific analysis of potsherds from the Harappan ruins of the Indus Valley has shown that Indians have been enjoying their celebrated rice curries for well over 4,000 years. But it was the Romans who prized these spices so highly, sending something like 120 ships per year to import this famous black gold, though not everyone was a fan. The natural philosopher Pliny the Elder lamented the vast cost of this dangerous import exercise, and angrily muttered, "Pepper has nothing in it that can plead as a recommendation to either fruit or berry, its only desirable quality being a certain pungency, and yet it is for this that we import it all the way from India." While it's fun to see an old man whinging about pop culture, who doesn't love that, even 2,000 years ago, Pliny was in the great minority, and remained so long after his unfortunate volcano-related death, because spices weren't just about the flavours, they were also believed to possess medicinal powers, and were a splendid way of showing off. To the very wealthiest, a garnish of spices was like a gold-plated helicopter, an unnecessary extravagance for an already pricey privilege. There's a modern myth that spices were popular in late medieval cookery to cover the taste of rotting meat, but that's like saying Russian caviar might mask the acrid flavours of a cheap pot noodle. No one rich enough to ship in spices from halfway around the globe would then skimp on fresh meat and veg. So, given the demand for India's celebrated export, it's hardly surprising that the publication of Ptolemy's Geographia soon had navigators theorising about whether there was a quicker route to the mysterious Indies. And by the late 1480s, Genoa's own Columbus, a resident of a city built on the cash from the spice trade, had hatched a plan. Having studied the works of Marco Polo, Ptolemy, Strabo, Marinus of Tyre, Alfagani, and the recent theories of the Italian astronomer Paolo Toscanelli, he was certain that all he had to do was sail west, and he would bump straight into the Indies. After all, the Roman writer Seneca had cheerfully written that it was possible to make such a voyage in just a few days. Columbus, however, wasn't entirely happy with the measurements passed on from ancient geographers, and so cobbled together his own calculations. This wasn't his best idea, and he got almost everything wrong. The size of Eurasia, the circumference of the globe, the fact he later thought he was sailing uphill, and a belief that the world was therefore pear-shaped. When he finally did blunder into Hispaniola and Cuba, his knowledge of Marco Polo's travels convinced him that he was just off the coast of China, a perfectly forgivable mistake. But unfortunately, Columbus was also a bit of a self-aggrandizing prat, and that's less easy to let slide. He unfairly claimed the reward for first spotting land, taking credit from a sailor named Rodrigo de Triana. And when he got back to Spain, he grossly exaggerated what he had found, boasting of endless spices and eye-popping riches, despite the fact that his glorious bounty, when unloaded from the ships, was actually a ramshackle assemblage of stuff, including tobacco, pineapples, some gold, a few native captives, a turkey, and, least impressively of all, a hammock. The gold went down well, but I can't imagine the King and Queen of Spain were particularly enthralled by the suspended seat. Imagine if we sent a team to Mars, and they came back with little more than a hovering sofa bed. I think we'd want our money back. It was all very interesting, but Columbus had set out for spices, and the ones he'd brought back didn't smell like, or look like, any of the spices from the Indies. In fact, one of the plants he thought was pepper turned out to be the chili plant, and the reason we call it a chili pepper is due to his error. Not everyone back in Spain was convinced of his grand claims, but the pig-headed Columbus managed to wangle funding for another 3 voyages, and in the process begat the golden era of Spanish exploration that eventually bankrupted the Spanish economy and inadvertently introduced lethal smallpox to tens of millions of indigenous South Americans. As a man, Columbus himself is certainly not deserving of heroic status in the USA. He never set foot in North America and pretty much laid the groundwork for the incalculable horrors of the transatlantic slave trade, which just makes the existence of Columbus Day seem like a bad taste joke. But if we separate the man from the mission, his accidental discovery of a new world really was the Renaissance equivalent of landing on Mars, and it undoubtedly changed the course of global history, including the story of food. And as we slice open our tin can, inside we find white haricot beans drizzled in a tomato sauce, seasoned with black pepper and sweetened with sugar. All ingredients with a heritage dating back to the Spanish conquest of the Americas and the subsequent race for New World empires fought between the Dutch, French, British and Portuguese. Fascinatingly, the subsequent spread of South American plants and foods resulted in a global fusion of ingredients so emphatic that we now associate tomatoes with Italian food rather than that of the Aztecs, and chili peppers with Indian curry, despite them only being introduced to South Asia in the 1500s. You say potato. The guards stood defiantly round the edge of the fields, weapons in hand, as the local peasants peered past them, hunting for clues as to what precious luxury might be sprouting from the soil. Their curiosity inflamed, the locals patiently waited for dusk to settle and watched with eager delight as the soldiers abandoned their posts and traipsed to their barracks for the night. With no sentries on duty, these scruffy peasants scurried out into the fields, dug up the crops by moonlight, and ferried them quietly back to their own strips of land for replanting. Whatever aristocratic nosh this was, they were going to sample it first. When news of the dramatic theft reached the owner of the fields, he was delighted. His cunning plan had worked brilliantly. As we chuck some shredded potato hash browns into the frying pan, it may not occur to us that the story of the potato is a controversial one, and that the humble spud was once greeted with a mixture of haughty disdain and desperate panic. As with tomatoes, potatoes had been a South American food, and the Inca had grown them at altitude, making use of the night frost to freeze-dry the tubers into dehydrated starch, almost like our frozen French fries. And this had allowed potatoes to be a long-life food source to fill the gap when other crops failed. Yet, upon arrival in Europe in the 1570s, the launch of such a nutritious and practical foodstuff was nothing but a spectacular PR disaster. In 1596, the Swiss botanist Caspar Bohin named the potato Solanum tuberosum esculentum, but provided a scarily dramatic drawing of the plant in his book, and accessorized it with scurrilous gossip, suggesting that it caused flatulence, lust, and leprosy, a holy trio of embarrassment guaranteed to ruin any romantic encounter. We're not sure why he decided this, but perhaps he came to this conclusion due to the somewhat lumpen, gnarly shape of his sample potato, which maybe resembled the ravaged limbs of leopards.